So, please have a seat. I hope that you have gotten some refreshments. And I also hope that you found this morning very interesting. Yes, I'm glad to hear. So we will now move on to another field, and we will take a look at some new thoughts and ideas concerning economics for a sustainable world. First, we will meet Mr. David Collste from Stockholm Resilience Center, who will present the ideas from a fresh scientific report called Economy and Finance for a Just Future on a Thriving Planet. And it was launched yesterday, so it's very fresh. After listening to Mr. Collste, we will meet the co-president of the Club of Rome, Ms. Sandrine Dixson-Declève, who will give us a peek into the coming report of the Club of Rome, which will be released in September when they celebrate their 50th anniversary. She will also describe the work done in the global campaign Earth for All. But first of all, then, I would like to welcome up on stage Mr. David Collste from Stockholm Resilience Center. Hello, David. You're very welcome.
Thank you very much, Anneli. I'm looking forward to present a report that is actually not even launched today. It launched yesterday. It's gonna be launched today. So this is a sneak peek of the report. If you want to come to our launch, it's at 2 p.m. this afternoon. And the title is Economy and Finance for a Just Future on a Thriving Planet. And this is what we want, right? But where are we today? 50 years has passed since the Stockholm meeting, since the Stockholm Declaration, half a century. Where are we on the planet? Are we on a just future on a thriving planet? One key insight that we've got over these decades is that the human species, Homo sapiens, is a remarkable species. Our species have shown the capacity to create beautiful things in many ways, with an unprecedented capacity to communicate and cooperate across time and space. What is worth, however, is that we have shown that we have the power to influence the future of all life on Earth. Looking back over the last hundreds of years since the Industrial Revolution, we see this rapid growth in socioeconomic developments here in red. Yes. So we see population, we see GDP, but we also see energy use, large dams, and so on and so forth. But what is worrisome here is that our socioeconomic development is also reflected when we're looking at the Earth system trends, here in blue. This is what sustainability scientists, we refer to this as the Great Acceleration. And the speed of the acceleration has increased since the Stockholm conference. You see here a rapid, profound, and exponential increase in the human pressures on the planet. And the time is characterized by a simplified planet, where processes and ways to handle things are getting streamlined across the planet. We see also that we are transgressing planetary boundaries. And worrisome is that we're passing critical tipping elements with a risk of devastating the future well-being of future generations. So who is responsible for where we are today? In a recent paper by Hickel et al., they show that the planetary overshoot is not equally distributed, but the excess of use in natural resources is distributed in the way you see behind me here. That is, the US alone is responsible for 27% of the overshoot. The EU and the UK, 25%. And the rest of Europe and high-income countries, 24%. Together, high-income countries are responsible for 74% of the overshoot. And how many live in these countries? Only 16% of the world population. So we see that this overshoot of planetary boundaries is not evenly distributed. But what is also worrisome is when we look at the other side of the coin. So as I have explained here, we have the greenhouse gases, for example, from high-income countries that carry a historical responsibility. But the lower-income countries have much less responsibility of ecological breakdown and much less ability to cope with the consequences in the terms of sea level rises, adaptation, flooding, and drought. So it's the rich countries that already has the capacity to better adapt to the future that the high-income countries have created. So one conclusion from the report that we're launching today is that we need different indicators. We need to change how we see indicator of human well-being, macroeconomic performance, and when we assess investments, financial investments. So it's not enough to just take a snapshot, look at where we are today, but we also need to consider what's beneath the surface of the iceberg. So on top of the iceberg, we only have the 10% that is visible today. And this is shading what's underneath the surface, such as the observed trends. And trends in the form of, for example, the great acceleration that I have presented. But we need to dive even deeper to look at the underlying structure in this indicator iceberg. So what's behind? We have realized by looking at the great acceleration and research on the relationships of human pressures and planetary Earth system trends, we see that the human and the planet is deeply intertwined today. And our future depends on how we handle this relationship. So such indicators, for example, I think Achim Steiner mentioned in his previous talk half an hour or so ago, is that when we measure human development, we also need to account for planetary pressures. And this is because otherwise, the human well-being of today come at the expense of the well-being of future generations. So in the Human Development Report of 2020, in which me and colleagues wrote the background report, they presented a new Human Development Index, not only accounting for income, health, and education in the index, but also for planetary pressures. But in our report, we argue that this is not enough. We also need to assess the planetary pressures in relation to frameworks such as the planetary boundaries. Otherwise, there is a risk that the well-being of today is jeopardizing the well-being of the future generations. So Kate Raworth is presenting the work. I saw her here actually on this stage a couple of years ago when she was presenting the donut economics. The figure showing that we have an ecological ceiling represented by the planetary boundaries, but we also need to live up to a social foundation. So in a way, this is what is attempted with a new planetary adjusted human development index. But this is for the first time presented here with a new assessment of the chemical pollution, new research on science on plastics, and also freshwater change. So we see now that we're transgressing more boundaries than earlier assessments have shown. Furthermore, we also need different indicators to assess financial investments. My colleagues wrote an article in a paper where they presented this figure, where we have currently the current state of the environmental, social, and governance assessment metrics of financial investments are generally wrong. They don't have the precision. If you compare different rating agencies, they would rate companies differently, basically. So the precision is not there. But what is worse is that the accuracy is not there either when measuring financial investments. What I mean with that is that they do not measure the right thing. So not only do they differ between the assessments, but they do not measure relevant environmental indicators. Currently, they only measure carbon emissions relevantly. But if you look at, for example, deforestation, companies that score high on ESG may also be companies that are not limiting the deforestation. So here we see that the ESG metrics of today, they are not measuring the right thing. So that they don't have the precision, but what is worse, they are not accurate. So the last chapter of our report, we have a call for action to move forward. So what do we need to move forward? We need transformative capacities for people and planet. To begin with, we need to define a new direction. And the first step of doing this is to acknowledging the new planetary reality, that we are in the great acceleration, that we have entered the Anthropocene. But second, we also need to imagine and think about different futures in which the human is thriving on a planet with healthy ecosystems. The second insight is about that we need to create enabling conditions. And here we can tap into norms and values, as we see that they are very important in deciding the future of our collective human development. And the recent large-scale surveys carried out all across the world, for example in the G20 countries, but also beyond, show that we here actually have a positive development. We see that people support climate action and biosphere stewardship. So here we can tap into the people's opinions. But we also need economic policies that are based on systems perspective, where we see both people and planet. One can also mention here that we need to move even without consensus. That although a consensus is a good foundation for an forceful action, we need action so urgent now that we may need to move even without consensus to move ahead in the sustainability transformation. But it's also about phasing out. So that the sustainability transformation is not only about leveling, scaling up current sustainability pathways, but it's also about leaving, letting to die. And this can be difficult. We will lose jobs in certain sectors, for example, the fossil fuel industries. So we need different ways and measures to die with dignity. Because a job is not only an income, but also part of one's identity. So even though there will be more green jobs and jobs in different sectors, we need to have strategies to cope with the distributional consequences of the change. Finally, we need to accelerate investment actions. While the interest of climate-friendly investment has grown substantially, as is evident in our report, we show, as I mentioned here on the indicators, that this direction is not represented in what the investments are. So they are not in the accurate things. So we can tap into the direction and the interest of sustainability investments, but we need to acknowledge what actually is a sustainable investment and the limitations of current frameworks. So to conclude, our planet has changed profoundly in the last 50 years. We see an acceleration of the already great acceleration. The opportunities for a just future on a thriving planet today is probably bleaker than they were 50 years ago. But through these 50 years, we have also learned through science, innovation, and action-based knowledge that there is a willingness and interest in changing this direction. So the science of today is overwhelmingly clear. We urgently need to act. And to quote the slogan of the Stockholm +50 meeting, this is both our opportunity, but it's also our responsibility. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David, for this. I will soon invite you to the stage again, but before that, we will welcome our next speaker, Ms. Sandrine Dixson-Declève, who is the co-president of the Club of Rome, and she is with us digitally on link, hopefully. So we'll see if we can.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. There you are now. You're so very welcome. Fortunately not.
It It says that I'm sharing. Okay, let's see, swap displays. Does it work now?
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay. So apologies, everyone. I was due to be with you, but now have COVID and I'm stuck in Brussels. I very much am pleased to be able to deliver to you a project which we are also launching at Stockholm. All the results are coming in and it's called Earth for All. And this project has been the compilation of a great deal of effort coming from scientists, economists, and actually now campaigners, as we build very much on the evidence of the limits to growth. As co-president of the Club of Rome, and this is the 50th anniversary of the limits to growth, a seminal report which clearly demonstrated already in 1972 that we were going beyond the planetary boundaries. As David has so well put us through, you can see that already since 2009, with the incredible information and gathering of science that was undertaken by Johan Rockström and others, we know that we have gone far beyond those planetary boundaries. And this was actually already predicted in the limits to growth. So what we've tried to do as scientists and economists coming together is revisit those initial scenarios in the limits and come forward with a new proposal called Earth for All, a survival guide for humanity. And what I'm going to do is lead you through some of those key outputs and why this is so important at this time, in particular as you are all there in Stockholm, and I wish I could be with you, because what needs to come out of this week is very much a declaration from governments that we must actually change the course of history now. Interestingly enough, you can see that already in 1972, we were making statements like this one. This supreme effort is a challenge for our generation. This could actually be a statement that we're making now, but we made it in 1972, and it cannot be passed on to the next. This effort must be resolutely undertaken without delay, and significant reduction must be achieved during this decade. If you look at the scenarios that came out of the limits to growth, the predictions were that we would have a series of different crises coming around the 2020s, which is exactly what we're seeing now. Crises which would be hitting our food system, our energy system, due to growing population and going beyond the planetary boundaries. This is a wake-up call, and it's incredibly important that we take into consideration a variety of different aspects. And this is why we have put together this system dynamic modeling to take into consideration the geopolitical tipping points, the fact that we're actually seeing the 3 C's, climate, COVID, and conflict coming at the same time, and we therefore need to plan through chaos. The fact that we have to have an economic reset, that as economies that are in lockdown are releasing the biggest stimulus packages, and yet we need to ensure that those packages take into consideration people, planet, and prosperity. The fact that multilateralism is on the test bench, that America and China luckily joined the climate leadership, but now with the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, this is testing geopolitical power and could obviously have an impact in terms of the way we move forward with regard to protection of people, planet, and prosperity. But the fact also that we continue to have activism with renewed vigor, that we have the Greta effect, that we have young women and men that are in the streets asking us to act now and calling upon us to make some of those brave moves that need to be taken, both in terms of policy shifts, but also in terms of economic and financial shifts. And there is a paradigm change in European politics. And as Stockholm is in Europe, and as we're seeing also the recent plea to join NATO, may I bring in the fact that Europe is actually now behind a new vision, which is the European Green Deal as a new strategic objective. So why is this such an important time then to make a difference and to move on in terms of the way in which we look at interconnected global instabilities? We now need to think about deep systems change. That means that we need to address the social system, the inequalities that we have, the differentiators that we have in terms of population growth in some areas and older populations in other areas. The sense-making of disruption from social media. But then the economic system itself. We have growing mass unemployment. endemic economic insecurity, short-termism and profiteering, trade wars. And we're seeing that this is the first generation that will most likely make less than its parents. The global commons are under threat, as was so clearly indicated by David, but is being indicated by many who are speaking this week. The pandemic, alongside climate tipping points, and species extinction and biodiversity loss. And then, of course, there is the political system. Short-term decision-making, polarism and distrust, the rise of nationalism and authoritarian regimes, the pullback from international cooperation and questioning of the Bretton Woods institutions. All of this forces us to think through how can we actually shift the current direction that we're in for greater well-being and planetary boundaries. That is the vision of the group that came together, the Club of Rome, the Norwegian Business School, Stockholm Resilience Center, and also the Potsdam Institute, to think through what does 21st century transformational economics look like today, and what type of modeling do we need to look at system dynamics to get us out of this mess. What we started to see is that overall well-being is declining. We know that even with continuous growth, in those regions where we've seen those growth, well-being continues to decline. And you can see the huge differential in this graphic. But we also know that we have transformational economic models for the 21st century. David already mentioned Kate Raworth's donut economics, but we have a series of different new indicators for well-being. We have mission economies that have been promoted at the European level, and green growth. We're talking about post-growth, and we have new beyond GDP indicators, all of which are starting to take into consideration social and environmental risks into financial and economic decision-making. They're also expanding our perspective of public goods and socializing the rewards of environmental and social commons. And they're correcting the inequity between high and low-income countries created by international finance and trade systems. In addition to that, all of these new models take into consideration the increase in the need of agency of women and workers to drive the direction of the economy, because we know that we need diversity in order to deal with the complexity of the situation at hand. So a well-being economy actually recognizes that the economy is embedded in society and the rest of nature. We are not separate from nature. We are part of nature. And when we start to be part of nature, we then have to place a value on nature. It needs to be understood and managed as an integral and interdependent system of social relations. The fact that we need to address prosperity for all, not just a continuous growth of wealth for certain and just the continuous amount of poverty for others. And that it takes into consideration consumption and addresses human development as separate from growing emissions due to production, so that actually we can very much look at human well-being as a fundamental component of national wealth. So what we've tried to do is look at what would be the key turnarounds, the minimum that we would need to move towards well-being and remain within the planetary boundaries. And through our systems dynamic modeling and the group of modelers, the lead modeler actually being one of the original authors of the Limits to Growth, Jürgen Randers, we have agreed that we need to address poverty, empowerment, equality, food, and energy equally if we're going to move forward towards a well-being economy. That means that first we need to transform and accelerate human development in low-income countries by reforming the international financial and trade system. We then need to transform wealth distribution by ensuring the wealthiest 10% have no more than 40% of national income. And then focus on transforming the energy system to have emissions of greenhouse gases every decade, looking both at energy supply and energy demand. And then transforming agriculture, something that both the energy system and the food system are so important for the moment, ensuring that actually we look at regenerative and nature-positive agriculture while we shift also our energy system towards net zero. And then very importantly, as we look at population growth in certain regions, transforming the gender power imbalances so that we empower women and invest in education for all. So what does this mean in terms of implementation? Because one thing that we've learned from the Limits to Growth and 50 years working through the different publications of the Club of Rome is that if we are truly going to make a difference, we have to shift from just the science-based decision-making and understanding the importance of that decision-making into how we bring more people on the journey. How do we truly influence the minds and the hearts and souls of more people through our campaign? A campaign which will be looking at holding citizen assemblies and global public surveys, understanding what citizens' needs are, but also bringing them on this journey of transformation. Influencing the international agenda through all of the different negotiations that we're seeing, whether it be the COPs or whether it be the CBDs, whether it be G7 or G20. Ensuring that we support national policymakers, that we actually give them the arguments so that they can bring citizens on the journey rather than being too frightened to make these brave decisions through their short-term political cycles. Engaging with influencers and ensuring that we also use media, content, and engagement as a way to bring more people on board. So the way in which we're looking at translating all of this incredible material and the book, which actually will be published already in 5 different languages in September, is to bring the narrative through the policy change into the mindset shift, to prioritize over the next 2 years, because remember, this is the decade of action, trying to bring as many countries and different organizations on board as we create that mindset shift so that we actually do have an impact over the next 2 years through this incredible insight that we've been able to bring together through the science and the economic thought leadership. And let me give you an example of what this would look like in Europe. If we were going to move beyond GDP in the EU, and by the way, in 2 weeks, we will be having a major hearing in the European Parliament on this very point, and we'll be working with Dennis Meadows, the original author with Dana Meadows of The Limits to Growth, to ensure that we actually look at regional and domestic policy, but also international policy within the European dimension. That would mean that we would expand and standardize well-being indicators throughout all indicators, policy design and evaluation processes. And by the way, the Directorate General Foresight in the European Commission and also DG Research and Innovation are already starting to look at this, and we are setting up a collaboration with them on this very point. That we continue to push the Green Deal forward to deliver a just and net zero transition. But as we do that, that we think of the implications of the rest of the world. The fact that we cannot just push a Green Deal, which is going to be a fortress Europe, and not take into consideration trade impacts if we stop trade with certain countries. And we've just published, actually with other partners, an international systems change compass on this very point. That we explore the potential of a fee dividend scheme to compensate all Europeans for the private sector's use of global commons. This is what we call a citizen fund, and actually could be tapped into in the same way that you see in Norway and other countries. It's been used in Alaska to ensure that we actually tax the use of the global commons and then integrate that tax into a dividend scheme for more citizens as they are forced to transition through this new economy. And then on the international side, that we explore an international mechanism by which to compensate citizens, so exactly as I've just described, and that we advocate for major reform of international financial and trade policy. So for us, this is not a pipe dream. This is not a utopia. These extraordinary turnarounds are an essential foundation for a resilient civilization under extraordinary pressure. We do not have any more time. This is the decade of action, and what Earth for All hopes to do is to bring forward some key solutions as to how we can act as we move forward so that we don't miss out on another 50 years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandrine, for this very interesting presentation. I will now invite again to the stage Mr. Collste. So please have a seat. And just to let the audience know here that we have a screen here, so when we talk to Sandrine, we will not sit like this. we will look there. So I will start with a question for you, Sandrine. looking back on to the limits of growth scenarios from 1972, how would you say that the world has developed? And when it comes to the new report, what do you think that it will contribute to?
Thank you for that excellent question. I think two aspects, and I'm asked that question a great deal especially from young activists. I just wrote a book actually with two young activists, and when we went through that whole dialogue, that was the first question that they asked me. What is it that you did over the last 50 years? And I think that what happened is the limits to growth came at a time of economic boom. And so many decision makers did not want to listen to the messages of the limits to growth. So in terms of how we've developed, we did put in place an amazing amount of environmental legislation. And for the last 35 years, I've worked with policymakers in order to do that. But what we didn't do is we didn't actually link up the systems in the way in which we should have. We still continued in siloed thinking. Environment was separate actually from human development. And I think now what we truly need to do is to join the dots, to actually address the fact that our systems are sick in the same way that we are as a civilization. We know the impacts from overproduction, from overconsumption. We know the addictions that we have actually, not only to some drugs, which are clearly creating issues in the United States and in other areas, but also to the fact that materialism has not necessarily brought well-being. And I think what we need to do now, at this time of crisis, and this is the problem, because we are in the midst of a series of crises, is truly find those levers that systemically can make a difference very fast. That is what this report tries to do. It says, listen, if we look at those 5 turnarounds, because we cannot just focus on energy and food without looking at poverty, without looking at inequality, without looking at equity and empowerment as the key points. And that's one of the major learnings, I think, from our new research around the limits to growth, is that if we are going to address the food system, the energy system, our mobility system, we have to look at the tensions with poverty and inequality. Look at the Gilets jaunes. It's a perfect example of where we went wrong, not actually transforming the diesel tax into a different tax so that it wouldn't have an impact on more people's lives and livelihoods. We need to get smarter and more strategic. That is what Earth for All is trying to do. And what we're doing is not necessarily bringing forward a huge amount of body of new evidence, although there is some, but in particular compiling the evidence that we see into key systemic levers that will make a difference.
Thank you so much for this insightful answer, really. And now I turn to you, David, here. If we, looking back 50 years of understanding the Earth systems, how would you say that science has developed? And we take a look at the new report then. How can it contribute, you think?
Yes, I mean, the last 50 years, it's very interesting to see what happened 50 years ago, both the limits to growth, it was the Stockholm meeting, it was also the beginning of the Gaia hypothesis, the hypothesis that the Earth is somehow a self-regulating system. And then we also had this photo, the blue marble, the first time we saw the Earth from space, and we started to understand the fragility of this little marble. What's interesting that I think Sandrine brought up in her presentation is also that looking back the 50 years, the world has developed very much in line with the scenarios, the kind of standard run scenario of the limits to growth. But what limits to growth was doing was putting all these different environmental pressures into one variable called pollution. So what we've understood since these last 50 years is what pollution means. And it's profoundly climate change, but also biodiversity loss and all the rest of the planetary boundaries. So I think that while some of this research back in '72 was really at the outskirts, the Gaia hypothesis was, for example, not really seen as a scientific basis to continue from, and also the limits to growth, we see more and more evidence that kind of what some people thought were alarming at that time, or not possible, we're not at that bad stage, is actually happening. And that's very, 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 very frightening to see. and especially I would say that the understanding of the planetary boundaries, what pollution means, what limits that are actually there. That's the most of the increased evidence that we got.
Well, thank you for this answer. And now I will turn to both of you here. Since since science has developed and the insights were there already 50 years ago, but what might be the reasons then for us not being on track today? Good question.
Yes, can I start?
Yes.
Yes, go,
Yes.
go.
Yes. No, I think that what's happening, that change in norm, values, and understanding is going very slowly. You know, as we mentioned, when we think about the world, we think often like from here, maybe a Swedish perspective or a high-income countries perspective. And as I said here in my talk, that's a very minority of the world population. So I think that we need to acknowledge that there are very many worldviews combined, and there's the electorates are asking for some things, while maybe the scientific understanding is something else. So as Sandrine mentioned very clearly here, it's not enough to have science saying that this is where we are, this is what we need, but we need to broaden this to campaign, to increase the understanding. We need citizen assemblies and different kind of tools in order to get the message out, but also make people reflect and imagine a beautiful future.
Yeah.
What does a meaningful life look like? And it is not the current kind of gray growth based development that we are seeing. It's a different view. When we ask people in the Earth for All campaign, we did big surveys, and we see that people are really supporting climate action, as I mentioned in my talk. So we see that from the people's perspective, they ask for change nowadays. But I think we also need to acknowledge that things take time to understand. Hopefully, I'm too young to judge this, but hopefully what we see is that the alarming reports are coming out, the IPCC and so on and so forth, and IPCC should be noted is a quite conservative report, but it's still very alarming these days, is that what was before on the outskirts of science and society is now becoming like a central piece. As the Limits to Growth authors said back in 72, in the beginning of the 21st century, what will be on top of the international agenda will be related to global commons. And that's exactly what we see today, that the issues that are most crucial to deal with relates to global commons or climate change and the planetary boundaries.
Thank you, David. Sandrine, what are your views? Do you agree with David here, or do you want to add? What are your views?
I absolutely agree with David, and I'll maybe add to his last point, which is it is truly the fact that we now see that the consciousness that we are as vulnerable as the most vulnerable link through COVID, through climate. I mean, these crises were not happening actually 50 years ago. They were predicted, but they weren't happening. We were in the midst of an economic boom. And when we're in the midst of an economic boom and politicians are doing quite well based on the back of that economic boom, of course they're not going to make the difficult decisions that they need to. But when they're faced with crises on their doorstep, like having to deal with COVID or having to deal with climate change, then absolutely they have to look at how they're going to plan through these crises and think of the future, because citizens are demanding it. And as David says, not only did our surveys demonstrate that actually citizens were aware of climate change and wanted to have action, but also that they're aware that this is not the economy that is truly servicing them or the planet. We had 75% of citizens from G20 countries who were claiming that they would prefer to be in a well-being economy. Now, that means in the past, we would have said, oh, well, that's about sacrifice. But now, if you look at the fact that the economy is not servicing, especially the younger generation who's going to be making less than its parents, if you look at the climate anxiety and pandemic anxiety that now most young people have, and if you look at also the fact that we have the highest suicide rates and the highest mental illness rates, especially in the north where well-being should be the highest because wealth is the highest. You put all of that together and you can see that this is a moment where we truly can bring citizens on board for a completely different model. And that is why I think that this book is coming out at a time, and these very clear recommendations when policymakers can tap into that consciousness and can tap into the crises and bring people on board and say, we are going to move towards something that truly is servicing people, planet, and prosperity at the same time.
Thank you, Sandrine, for this. And I'll just, we don't have much time left, but I'm very curious. The Stockholm Plus 50 meeting starts tomorrow. What are your expectations? If you just shortly try to package this. Would you like to start something?
First, yeah, I mean, we've been both David and I were part of some of the leaders' dialogues and part of the UN dialogues. And having now worked through, I don't know how many different UN negotiations and being co-chair also of the UN Food System Summit, I'm very disappointed, to be frank. I'm disappointed with the lack of ambition of governments. We will be coming out as the Club of Rome with our Planetary Emergency Partnership and our Earth for All partners with a clear statement that clearly asks for a recall of at least implementing the pledges that have been made on biodiversity, on climate change, and on human equity, to ensure that we do truly start to transfer the funds that we have been promising, such as the 100 billion, etc. And I say this because there have been so many declarations, and if Stockholm Plus 50 is another set of declarations or pledges that lead us nowhere because they are not implemented, then we have once again lost a huge amount of time and goodwill from a great deal of people who truly are ready to step up to the plate and show the ambition that's needed. At the end of this week, we need some brave leaders to come forward from Stockholm and say, we are not going to waste another 50 years and we're not going to waste another 10 years. This is the decade of action. We will step up to the plate and make sure that we do what we need to do in our economic system, in our financial system, in order to protect people, planet, and prosperity. That is what I'm expecting, and that's what I hope will come out of it. Unfortunately, I'm not holding my breath.
Thank you so much, Sandrine, for this, and just stressing that this is actually the decade of action, and that's also something that we could hear yesterday when we had participants here on the floor from the youth, for example, that action is the word, the only word that we should use and what we should act upon, so to speak. We have enough words written in conventions and resolutions, so action is what we are going to do. David, what are your thoughts?
Expectations should be high. Yes, expectations should be super high. I think both me and Sandrine have been a bit disappointed, both at past UN conferences, but also what we see in the running up to this conference, unfortunately. Expectations should be really high, but maybe it's the citizens that need to act now. Maybe we need to move on all fronts in different parts of the world, in different parts of society, businesses, civil society, not least, to make the change possible. But one good maybe thing to see is that also this year is the halfway of the SDGs, and I see both you, Anneli, and Sandrine have the SDG flower here on your shirts, and that's very important, I think, to show that SDGs, the 23rd Agenda, is something that has really made a footprint, and hopefully started us to understand the intertwinedness between people and planet, and that we need concerted action.
Thank you so much, David, and thank you so much both for being with us here today. Thank you, and the very best of luck with your work. And David, before you move on, we have a small gift to you. And if you would have been here, Sandrine, I would be happy to give you a gift as well, but hopefully some other time if we can meet. Okay, but thank you so much for being with us from digitally. So thank you all, and now we have time for lunch. There's a lunch break, and we will meet here again. I think it is at 1 o'clock that we will start. And just to let you know that there are plenty of restaurants in the building and a little bit all over Stockholm, depending on how far you want to go. But we start again at 1 o'clock, so welcome back.